Hello, and welcome to Worm from Home, a podcast project where I hope you'll join me as I learn more about the environmental history of East London. I don't think East London is more or less environmentally interesting than anywhere else, but it's where I've lived for a decade, which makes it interesting to me, and also the place I interact with the environment the most. I've been wanting to make this project for a long time, and started thinking about it during the COVID lockdowns, when my world, like so many of ours, became very small, and things like what flowers grew in the cracks on the balcony and what birds came to feed in the local park suddenly became huge, important parts of my day-to-day life. I spent a lot of time trying to find nature in the city, wondering why that was, and what nature in the city actually even means. I'm making this show mostly as a good excuse to keep being curious about that, a framework in which to keep learning and, hopefully, sharing that learning with other people. From within the city, I think it's very easy to think of the environment as a place, and a place that exists elsewhere, far away from large concentrations of people, industry, and urbanism. But the environment is definitionally everywhere. Ecology is not something that exists in certain places, like in forests or in lakes, but describes the relationships between living things within a system that often includes human beings and our activities. While we might rationally be aware that the environment is around us and that it's something we ourselves are a part of, in my experience, it's not always intuitive to join that up with the way we interact with our immediate surroundings in daily life. By focusing my inquiries in my own neighbourhood, I hope to really close that gap in my own understanding. I think it's useful to make a habit of paying close attention to the manifestations of very large systems, be they natural, artificial, concrete, or intangible, in the minutiae of every day. I am particularly interested in the city, the supreme example of a habitat by humans, for humans, as a site of non-human life, as an ecosystem in its own right, and as the engine of environmental change outside of its own geographic limits. It's inherent to the idea of ecologies that smaller things are part of larger networks. Living things exist in webs of relationships, relations where entities affect each other in ways that are biological and physical, but also social and political. Some of these effects are direct and local, some more distant and tenuous, but the nature of ecology is that the local and the global can be in meaningful relationships to each other. I wonder if this is particularly true now, as a globalized economic system creates connections between things where they may not have existed before. I think we all come to thinking about the environment and climate change with sets of preconceived ideas, some of which we've thought through and chosen, and some that we've inherited from broader social assumptions, history, and a cultural consensus on what is natural or unnatural. I'm interested in interrogating these assumptions, how they structure how we think of the past, present, and potential future of our interactions with the environment around us. I'm especially suspicious of appeals to nature as an untouched state and as something that should or can exist entirely outside of humanity. Environmentalism may be a generally left-wing concern, but that does not make it immune from the sorts of conservatism that can creep in with prelapsarian notions of a clean and natural past versus a degraded and polluted present. The 19th century French anarchist Élisée Reclus wrote L'homme et la nature prenant conscience d'elle-même, or Humankind is nature becoming self-aware. I find this to be such a useful frame for thinking about humanity's peculiar position as a part of nature that can also imagine itself outside of it, and on our ability to inflict huge damage on the non-human natural world, but also inevitably suffer the consequences of that environmental damage ourselves. I also find this way of thinking a useful tool for resisting dichotomies of doomerism versus primitivism that say that we are creatures who can only either leave nature alone or destroy it, and instead think more deeply about relationships like symbiosis, husbandry, and real interspecies cooperation. This is another thing that draws me to the city. Here, all the strands that we often insist are in opposition are all undeniably knotted up together, the natural and the unnatural, the human and the non-human, but also the extractive and the nurturing, the built and the growing, as well as the organic and the inorganic. Where does the natural in the city end and the unnatural begin? How do we think about organic, non-human life in wholly unnatural landscapes like cityscapes? Why do we find these binary frames around the artificial and the natural so lacking, yet still seem to somehow need them to think about the world? This project is not about necessarily answering any of those questions or resolving these tensions. Some of them I'm not even sure there are answers to. But I think they are tensions that we have to consistently bear in mind and refer to when considering the politics, aesthetics, and impacts of our everyday interactions with our environments. Time is a crucial factor here too, hence the focus on the environmental history of the habitats we will consider. This is partly for obvious and explicitly political reasons. Innumerable ecosystems are changing, and for the worse, at often unprecedentedly fast rates, directly because of large-scale human activity, the nature and destructive capacity of which is shaped by ideology and imbalances of power, as well as human technological capacity that itself continues to increase with the passage of time. But alongside that, ecological systems are always in flux, with or without our intervention or even presence. By insisting on looking at the environments that surround us in historical context, I think we can force ourselves to consider them not as static objects, but as the processes that they are. Environments change, an obvious fact, but one worth attending to. Flowers might open in the morning and close at nightfall, regulating an ideal balance between pollinator access and moisture preservation. Cycles of animal, plant, and fungal reproduction fill the air with spores, with seeds, with song. They create new life, go dormant, die, and begin again. Soil erodes every rainy season, maybe a little more each season than the last. Maybe what can grow there changes with that soil alteration, shifting the flora, which alienates some animals and attracts others in new combinations. Human beings move across the world, bringing our animals and plants from one place to another, as well as all the ways that we touch the land, for better and worse. So many wheels, turning fast or turning slow, intersecting each other, moving a landscape back and forth within its seasons, and sometimes to a new way of being entirely. No snapshot captures this. No landscape painting or even single memory of being in the woods or walking on the shore. An ecosystem in its totality is always happening. I think one way we can make sense of that continual flux around us is to create narratives of these environments. Formal narratives, like schematizing a water cycle into the parts that are salient to us or useful for understanding this process in human terms. Or informal ones, fleeting ones. A story that starts in spring and ends in winter, or begins when a seed germinates and ends when a fruit is eaten by a passing squirrel. Stories that start in a rich woodland and end in its demolition, or begin in wasteland and tell how something new began to grow there. One such story we can tell is of how a woodland came to be growing in Bethnal Green. Bedded into the residential streets between the railway and Bethnal Green Road, a small but thriving woodland grows on the Bethnal Green Nature Reserve. It's quite well hidden. I lived in the area for years before I even noticed it, but maybe that's more on me. The reserve grows on an old Second World War bomb site, where it is tended to currently by phytology and its dedicated workers and volunteer caretakers, including, I'm proud to say, myself. As well as the woodland, there's a pond, medicinal herb garden, and even a small meadow of wildflowers. It's a beautiful and precious place. But how did this all come to be here in the middle of London? To my mind, this is a political story, as well as an ecological one. A story about war and destruction, and also care and renewal. About how politics and geography shape each other in turn, and how the outcomes for people living in a place are often determined by the meaning given to the land under their feet and to the woods that they walk in. To tell this story, we'll look at the history of woodlands and woodsmanship in Britain, and how human beings can create new categories like managed woodland and urban woods. We'll look at the effect of war and militarism on natural environments and consider how the Blitz violently disrupted East London's cityscape and some of what grew back there in the aftermath. Where would it make sense to start that story? Maybe when the reserve was first established, during the air raid that blew apart the buildings that sat on the site. Maybe when Bethnal Green became a place, or London. We could go as far back as the time vast plates shifted into place, creating the landmass now called Britain. A happy medium, I think, still artificial, but logical, is to start at the beginning of what constitutes the uninterrupted presence of woodland ecosystems in the British Isles. Approximately 11,000 years ago, as the ice withdrew at the end of the last ice age, there were no woodlands in what is now the British Isles. Dramatic changes in climatic conditions, of course, have a profound effect on the distribution of flora and fauna, and when the earth began to warm again, trees came to places that had previously been icy tundra. At this time, Doggerland had yet to be swallowed by the sea, and Britain was part of a contiguous landmass connected to mainland Europe. While plants can sometimes cross water, land is the more likely route, and as temperatures rose in northern Europe, trees from the warmer south began to arrive. What trees were these, and are they ones we would recognise today? Mostly, very much so. Archaeologists are able to date pollen deposits to estimate when certain plants were present in a landscape. According to Oliver Rackham, one of the definitive historians of the British countryside, these post-glacial trees arrived in waves, forming woodland as they began to establish themselves. The earliest woodlands in Britain included birch trees and aspens, beautiful trees with fluffy red and brown catkins and round leaves that shimmer in the sun like coins when the wind shakes them. By 8500 BCE, pine has arrived, as well as hazel, whose leaves are furry and serrated or curl in golden fringes around the fat brown nuts of the tree. Over the following 3,000 to 4,000 years, the British woodlands began to thrive, and in different regions comprised varying combinations of trees that still grow here today, like oaks and the wet-loving alder that grows in marshes and along riverbanks. There would also have been tall, smooth-barked limes that dangled with oval fruits, elm as well as holly, and ash trees clustered together, creating cover with their canopy for animals and other plants. There were beech and hornbeam that can live for 300 years while its winged fruits are spread by the wind, and maple with hand-shaped leaves and little sprays of bright green flowers. This climate change-driven forestation altered the landscape completely. Over several thousand years, the land changed from scrubby heathland with sparse, low-growing vegetation to a richly growing woodland. Strict definitions of such complex systems as woodland are bound to be lacking in some way. Organisms grow and begin to grow together in certain ways. Humans name those ways of growing according to the characteristics that are most salient to us, to our perception, or to our uses and experience of those landscapes. Modern forestry statistics used in the UK define woodland as an area of land of minimum 0.5 hectares standing under trees with canopy coverage of at least 20%. To help you visualise this, 1 hectare is 10,000 square metres, so the area of a square that is 100 metres on each side. This is a very useful definition for generating countrywide statistics of woodland coverage. A woodland is trees growing together and covering the land underneath them with their canopies. This captures something of the ecosystem that trees growing together in this way create, as well as being easily quantifiable to help researchers determine how much woodland we have growing here and if it's growing or shrinking. But what else characterises woodland, the particular ecosystem that these trees create and participate in? Their crowns form a canopy, and this itself becomes a habitat for other life, like nesting birds and the insects they feed on. This canopy and the variations in its coverage produce particular conditions of light and shade and of temperature on the ground below it, affecting what plants and animals are likely to live there. The lower growing portions of the trees themselves create underwood, slimmer, lighter wood growth than the trunks and branches, which itself entwines with other plants in the undergrowth. Such variety within the same area, such varied and interfacing zones of temperature, wetness, height, and light exposure attract a real multitude of organisms to live among the trees. Fungi and lichen growing on dead and living wood, with fruiting bodies that fringe tree trunks like jelly ear or boletes that pop up out of the decaying plant matter that mulches into new soil. We eat some of these fungi, tasty morsels like chanterelles, and other animals do too. The fat brownish pennywort, for example, feeds human beings, squirrels, slugs, and many different species of insect. Added to this are the flowering plants, the wood anemones, honeysuckles, foxgloves, wild roses, violets, too many to name. Food for the insects who pollinate them. Small wonder that there are more invertebrates living in woodland than in any other habitat in the UK. 1,000 species of beetle, and snails, slugs, moths and butterflies, bees. These populations in turn support the existence of birds and mammals. Several species of bat hunt insects in woodland by echolocation. Little vegetarians like voles and mice, and beautiful red-faced goldfinches. Some of these species become food themselves for the bigger hunters like long-eared owls and foxes. The sheer number and variation of species living in woodlands is not just due to the number of different zones of habitation in any single woodland, but to the number of different types of woodland that exist. We might say that this is a differentiation that starts with soil. Depending on the soil, one species of tree or another may be more likely to germinate and grow successfully. What is good soil is, of course, in the eye of the beholder, or in this case, of the grower. Of the trees that moved into the warming land as the ice melted, oak thrived in the more acidic soils, where it's often harder for other plants to grow, and this is still true today. Oak is often accompanied in its woodlands by heathers and bracken, other plants that also flourish in soils that are generally considered less fertile. Beech is a chalk lover, which in turn influences its geographic distribution. We already mentioned that alders love the wet, and as when they first arrived, they can still be found in Britain, growing in periodically flooded areas, where they're joined by willows and some birches, creating a habitat for wetland animals like frogs and toads who spend their breeding phases in and around the water. The woods really are a phenomenal site of life. They are life. All these cycles of living and growing, killing and feeding, dying and reproducing, they comprise the very woodland itself. As these processes repeat, they make changes in the land where woodland grows. A fallen branch is colonized by fungi that break it down. A dead animal decays on the ground, and certain chemical nutrients enter that ground as bacteria decompose the body. Soil is enriched and re-enriched by these events. Dead plant matter, old wood, all the debris of the woodland's processes create new structures and resources in the soil. Age then becomes a factor here. As time passes, the ecology of the woodland soil and its inhabitants is added to and transformed, and its complexity may multiply. This is part of what makes what is referred to in Britain as the ancient woodlands, places particularly rich in life. Pink-spotted lungwort lichens, red campions, lily of the valley, and several species of fern are just some of the plants that often grow in ancient woods. These woodlands are also host to specialist species of insect and fungi that only live in the particular habitats that these woods provide. The most ancient woodlands we have can be composed of dozens of different species of native tree and hundreds of flowering plants. Today, of the total UK woodland coverage of 3.25 million hectares, ancient woodlands comprise just over 600,000 hectares. The definition of woodland used here allows for quite a broad range of landscapes to be included, like plantation forest, where trees are planted for eventual harvesting as timber, places that have been deliberately reforested to revitalize woodland habitats, secondary woodland, where woods form organically on land that has previously been cleared or used for something else, and urban woodland, formed by clusters of trees growing in cities. In terms of UK land area as a whole, 13% is covered in any type of woodland, and 2.5% covered by ancient woodland. Just how ancient is this woodland? How is it related to the first woodlands to take root in Britain? How did we get from vast swathes of the landscape being covered in woodland to the 13% we have today? The ecosystem the post-Ice Age trees created as they took root is in Britain called wildwood. Wildwoods are woods that are not maintained by human intervention. They are of course characterized by a great number of pressures and circumstances, just like those we discussed: temperature, weather, and soil quality, the actions of animals large and small who break down fallen wood or nibble at germinating tree shoots, but they are distinguished by this lack of human intervention in their growth pattern. I wonder if this distinction is purely arbitrary, removing ourselves from the great number of animals who interact with and affect woodland ecosystems. It makes sense to us to think of environments in terms of our own interactions with them and to schematize them according to whether we affect them or not, whether we feel we control or influence their patterns. Perhaps a framework for describing the world around us in terms of what is within and outside of humanity makes a lot of sense, as much sense as a self that is within us and in everyone else who is outside of ourselves, at least from our point of view. From the woodland's perspective, though, would the distinction between wildwood and other woodland feel as salient? If the woods were to categorize themselves, would they find human activities so meaningful as to observe a before and after humanity, a with and without humanity? The first wildwoods in Britain were widespread, and woodland covered a great deal of land. Precisely how much we can of course not know, but archaeological evidence and analysis of pollen deposits can give us a good sense of the size and distribution of these early woods. To the north, birch flourished, with pine, Britain's only native conifers, a little further to the south. What is now North Wales and the West Country grew with oak and hazel and with elm. The sweep of the southeast, including parts of what is now London, were largely wooded with lime. 8,000 or so years later, over 99% of this woodland coverage has been lost. Wildwood has essentially disappeared, and this has absolutely been a human endeavour. People lived with the wildwoods, starting during what we would today call the Mesolithic, that is, a time of dominant use of stone tools. As flora had returned to a warming Britain, more and more people had come here too, crossing the ever-receding Doggerland land bridge. What exactly they made of this element of the landscape, in which ways they did or didn't feel connected to it, afraid of it, interested in it, we do not know. We have no records of their thoughts on the matter, at least not any that we can decipher. I'd love to know how they felt about the woods, what stories they told, whether the woodland was a place of peace, or fear, or both, or maybe something else entirely. What we do have is evidence of human interaction with the environment during this period. We know that people during this period did sometimes fell trees to create clearings, but not on a particularly large scale. They also created heathland by felling or thinning woodland, probably to make pasture for wild animals to hunt. This makes sense. As temperatures rise, stimulating the spread of dense woodland, the effect on food systems developed during periods of much more open landscape must have been incredibly disruptive. Clearing woodland to attract animals for hunting is a possible solution. However, in terms of woodland clearance, the impact of the people of this period is small. The woodlands to Mesolithic people in Britain would almost certainly still have been a wild place, a place that belonged to nature and not to humanity. Significant alterations to woodland coverage come in earnest in the Neolithic, triggered largely by its revolutionary change in the organisation of human life: farming. I would love to do a longer history of farming one day, but for our purposes here, suffice to say that globally, farming appears to come in fits and starts. People start planting alongside older food systems based on foraging and hunting. In some places, people start farming, then stop, then start again. Farming is a technology, and the very different new cultures that emerge around its use spread between different regions at different rates. In Britain, farming comes from the south, having made its way across what is now Europe and the Middle East, very roughly around 4000 BCE. At this point, Doggerland was long gone, washed under the sea, and the island cultures were likely less influenced by what people were doing on the continent than they had been. Societies in the British Isles retained hunting and foraging for a long time, often maintaining lifestyles that were part nomadic and part settled. Archaeological investigation suggests people moved in groups between areas most suited for finding food, likely on a seasonal basis, finding areas where sources of nutrition were richest and most varied, like places where several landscapes meet. If you make your home at the juncture of woodland, seashore, and open country, the variety of plants and animals you might be able to eat multiplies significantly. Agriculture came, relatively speaking, late to Britain, and, as elsewhere, changed everything. Old ways of life quickly died out. Whether people converted to agriculture because they thought it was a good idea, by force, or because they were already experiencing high food insecurity at the point of its introduction, is an open question. It's likely to be some combination of these factors. Everything changed. The way people built shelter, how they organized themselves socially, and, going by the rapid change in the examples of ritual architecture that are still standing, maybe even what they believed about the cosmos. For our story, the direct environmental impact of early farming is the crucial bit. The effect of agriculture on the landscape in Britain was surprisingly sudden and so fundamental that it reshaped the land in ways we still recognise today. In particular, farming people turned the landscape from one dominated by wildwood into something much flatter, more open, and that was much more under the management of human beings. Farming needs land, lots and lots of land that isn't put to other simultaneous uses for planting crops and for grazing animals. Through the Neolithic period and into the Bronze and early Iron Ages, when human tool-making turns to metal rather than stone, tens of millions of hectares of wildwood are cleared entirely, and the land under them is converted for farm use. So much woodland was felled and removed in this period that it is almost impossible to imagine the labour hours required of the still small population using hand tools. By roughly the year 500 BCE, about half of what is now England was no longer a wildwood landscape. This massive deforestation destroyed huge areas of animal and plant habitat and also created new ones. It is at once deeply destructive and intimately tied to human flourishing on the land. What interests me most is how early, relatively speaking, it happens. Much of this clearance was already completed by the 1st century CE when the Roman armies arrived in Britain, a place that, while it still held large woodlands, was already agricultural, already had a farming landscape of fields and pasture created and managed by the people living here. This could just be a somewhat depressing story, a trajectory of human inability to live within the native landscape of a place, a drive towards its destruction and the concomitant loss of so many other living things. But I don't think it's quite so simple. As people in Britain cleared huge tracts of woodland, they also began to interact with the woodlands they left in place in a new and fascinating way, developing practices of woodsmanship that created and maintained the managed woodland. Earlier on in this episode, I gave some woodland statistics for Britain in the present day, and mentioned that such estimates include several different types of woodland. The definition of a traditional managed woodland is tighter, and refers to a woodland that is not originally planted by human beings, but not wholly wild either, as it is consistently managed by people. Key to this practice is a distinction between wood and timber. Woodland management often takes the form of wood harvesting. In this context, wood refers to the smaller parts of the tree that can be removed without felling the tree as a whole, lighter branches and the parts of the tree that form the underwood. When a whole tree is felled to use its trunk, this material is called timber. Wood is a really versatile and relatively quickly renewable resource. If you need wood for building, for making tools, or to burn for fuel, felling a whole tree might get you more material in one go, but the lead time for more timber to grow will be very long. Trees are long-lived organisms, and they take time to develop to mature size. Wood, in comparison, grows back quickly, and the mature tree survives. The type of wood harvesting developed in Britain for managing woodland both extracts the resources and encourages it to regrow in certain ways. For example, you can coppice a tree, by cutting down most of the trunk and leaving a stump that is still alive. From the face of this stump will grow usually very straight, narrow branches that can be harvested every couple of years and used to make stick-shaped things like poles. Or you can encourage a tree to create suckers. Some trees, like elm, won't stand the stump creation process of coppicing, and the trunk will die if felled in this way. But its root system will survive and sprout small crops, called suckers, of pole-like branches straight from the roots. If larger animals are likely to eat your new crop of sticks before they reach the required size, you can pollard a tree instead, a similar process to coppicing, but where the trunk is left in place and clusters of smaller branches are periodically harvested from higher up, out of the reach of nibbling ground dwellers. If we were trying to evaluate what is wild and what is not, woodland management seems to create a hybrid landscape, one in which trees, other plants and animals maintain their core ecological relationships, but some of their behaviour is shifted by human intervention. Woodsmanship as resource management likely developed in the Bronze and Iron Ages in Britain, although it may have begun earlier. Archaeological digs have uncovered at least one wooden construction dating from 4000 BCE in Somerset, where both timber from tree trunks as well as rods likely harvested from underwood were used to build a walkway. The practice flourishes through the Middle Ages and becomes an established part of the relationship between people and plants in Britain, a way to manage necessary resources and a human imprint on the ecology of woodlands. Human management influenced the distribution and amount of underwood, as repeated coppicing encourages its growth and maintained desirable habitat for insects, mammals and birds. Where timber was needed, a tree might be felled, leaving a clearing into which light-loving woodland plants could rush. I wonder if, as human things like the need for fuel and desire to make tools altered the woodland things altered us in turn. The type of wheels you build when you're making spokes from sticks harvested from trees that pollard well, or building houses with poles from trees that will sucker. The need to access wood resources, and to maintain that access over time, also formed a culture of practical care for woodlands that endured for hundreds of years. This system of periodic wood harvesting and less frequent timber felling was still widespread into the 19th century, a centuries-long sort of symbiotic husbandry between people and the managed woodlands. I find it a deeply hopeful piece of history to consider, a feeling of something like a hopeful Anthropocene, a clear demonstration that as a species and the collection of societies and individuals we organise ourselves into, we do of course have enormous power to shape the world around us and everything else that lives in it, but we can make both judicious choices in exercising that power and are more than capable of understanding that what is in the long-term interest of the nature we live within is also often in our own long-term interest too. The estimated woodland coverage of England recorded in the Domesday Book was 15%, only a little higher than today's 13%. At this point, it is most likely that no true wildwood remained in Britain, and that the woods at large had been folded into human ways of life. Woodlands existed in relationships of ownership with people belonging to individuals or communities, and much later to companies or government entities. Total clearing of wooded areas, again largely for farmland rather than for use of the timber itself, does continue, and by the 17th century, woodland coverage stood at only about 8%. When we now define something as ancient woodland, it is considered to be at least this old, to have been a living system since the year 1600 or earlier. Throughout the medieval, early modern, and into the 19th century, people do continue to care for the woodlands they live with. They continue to harvest the underwood of ash, oak, elm, lime, and hazel for fuel, for industries like barrel making, and for material for fencing, even as other materials become more common in house building. It is in the latter part of the 19th century that traditional woodland management practices really fell away. By 1924, the recorded woodland coverage had reached its nadir, standing at just 5% across the UK as a whole. It would be really useful for my narrative here if there were one singular reason that we could point to, some fundamental alteration in people's sense of their relationship to the land that could account for this, but this seems to be unlikely. It's more likely that there were multiple factors at play, and woodsmanship changed and fell off gradually over time. landowners were removing large tracts of woodland to create parks. Another possible factor, as in so many instances, may be fossil capital and the changes it wrought in fuel use, and so the motivations to care for certain fuel sources. Paradoxically, the need for wood for fuel had afforded the woodlands considerable protection. These trees have to stand next year in order that we can harvest their wood to burn. As industrialisation picks up speed and coal begins to replace wood, the need to ensure the woods last and aren't overfelled for timber reduces. In simple economic terms, where woodlands still had value as sustainable resources and that value still outweighed the expense of clearing them, it was often easier to just let them stand. Another important factor, and one that interests me in particular, is war. War is a resource-eating machine and contributed significantly to the precipitous fall in woodland coverage at the turn of the 20th century, when huge amounts of trees were felled for timber use. But war is also closely tied into the recovery of Britain's woodlands, particularly through the establishment of forestry and the creation of the Forestry Commission, one of the legacies of which is the now steadily increasing proportion of woodland coverage, a number that has been rising in every part of the United Kingdom since the late 1920s. I'd like to keep these episodes short and digestible, so next time we'll dig deeper into how both woodlands and forestry share their history with warfare, how war both destroys woodland and can create it, and slowly start making our way back in this narrative to the woodland growing in Bethnal Green. Major sources for this episode were the works of Oliver Rackham, The Making of the British Landscape by Nicholas Crane, and survey materials published by Forest Research and the Woodland Trust. I will make a full bibliography available at the conclusion of this series of episodes. Thank you so much for listening to this first episode of Worm From Home. If you've enjoyed the show and want to support production, you can do so with words by leaving a rating and review on your podcast app, sharing the episode, or telling your friends and family. Or, if you'd like, you can support the show with money by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/wormfromhome. In either case, your support will be really, really appreciated. I'm making this show because I love radio and I love nature, but also to create opportunities for myself and others to learn. If you have any questions, feedback, or knowledge you'd like to share, or analyses of your own on topics we cover, please do get in touch on the Patreon, at wormfromhome on Twitter, or at wormfromhomepod on Instagram. Until next time.